Hello and welcome to Worldview. I am Vishal Dahiya. This week we're going to talk about a very significant summit meeting, that is the G7. In fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be participating in the G7 summit in Canada from 15th to 17th of June. Though the invite for this summit came a bit late from hosts Canada, it was accompanied with Canadian Prime Minister emphasizing India's stature among top 5 economies of the world, its key role in global supply chain, and its relevance to conversations on energy, security, and digital infrastructure. Group of 7, which is commonly known as G7, comprises of 7 countries: France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, USA, and Canada. Now, collectively, G7 represents almost 45% of the global GDP and approximately 10% of world's population. India's role as a non-member nation at G7 has evolved significantly over the years. So what does India bring to the table at G7? Why is this group important for India and vice versa as well? Also, what is the relevance of G7 in today's geopolitics? And is this a chance for India and Canada to mend their bilateral relations as well? For more on this, we're joined by 2 distinguished experts today, from whom we'll try and understand a bit more about all these questions and more wider aspects also. Let me first welcome them on the show. Former Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia is joining us, and so is Professor Gulshan Sachdeva from the Center for European Studies at JNU. Welcome both of you gentlemen to World. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Bhatia, and let's start by first, exploring a bit more about G7, understanding a bit more about this grouping, this multilateral forum specifically. The direct question, as I was pointing out in my intro, is how relevant is G7 in today's era, in today's world of geopolitics?
Thank you very much for inviting me to your show, Vishal. G7 has lost some of its importance and its gravitas, its impact and power as compared to the time when it began 50 years back in 1975. But still, it remains a factor of consequence in determining the international relations. As you rightly pointed out, this is the club of the most advanced economies in the world, some of the most successful democracies. This is the citadel of the West. And clearly, the common complaint of the rest of the world is that the West still calls the shots to a large extent. It used to be much more in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But I think starting from about 2008, with the rise of China, India, and other nations, G7 began to realize that it needed other countries in order to help steer the world economy. And this is the reason how they then worked on creating a parallel larger body, the G20, group of 20. And so it's very interesting that in the forthcoming summit in Kananaskis in Alberta, Canadian chair and host has thought it fit to gather as many as 8 countries which are outside G7, and 7 of them, really are from more or less the non-Western background, to be invited for the special outreach session. So the decision by G7 itself shows its own need to consult and coordinate with the rest of the world.
Okay. Professor Sachdeva, let me put the same question to you with a different, fact sheet there as well. As Mr. Bhatia was pointing out, there is a G20, there is BRICS as well, then there is Quad, then several other multilateral forums, and of course there is United Nations. Less said the better about that, but no Russia, no China. So again, the question is G7 relevant?
Well, I think as Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, it's not as relevant as it used to be 50 years ago, but still very relevant in certain ways because, it's not just G7, the European Union also sits there. So if you bring off the whole of Europe broadly here, and then you have Americans, Japanese, and Canadians. So obviously, roughly about, as you mentioned, more than 40% global economy is still in their hand. And this is also, in a sense, this is not just only about economy. I mean, when we're talking about G20, here we're talking about countries which are of certain consequence. Here, what we are talking about also Western countries, Western industrialized democracies. So there is a that's the kind of model they used to have, but now there are problems in a sense that they used to have a common view on many issues, and now today when they are going to meet after 2 days in Canada on major global issues, you look at trade, look at climate, look at Russia, and even issues concerning inclusion, sustainability, etc. Even when now that's a bad word in the US, DEI. So on all those issues where they used to have very common positions, now those things need to be tested again. Whether they will have a common position, there are tensions even among G7 we have seen between Canada and the US. And on major policy issues, there is a clear transatlantic divide. So even within G7, there are other issues apart from the relevance what they have in the global scene. But of course, still, since they are large economies, and they still have, the technologies in which they are leader in many of them. I mean, they are being challenged. Whether you look at artificial intelligence, quantum, or you look at green transition technologies, all are being challenged by the emerging economies, particularly by China and by others as well. So there are challenges which G7 is facing, and that is precisely the reason, as Ambassador mentioned. I mean, this was acceptance of the fact that G7 can't really resolve even economic problems, forget about other issues. So then you have a G20, and then you also have now BRICS, and they are now inviting many of those countries, many into their meetings for the last many years. So, because they clearly feel that those problems, whether you look at sustainable development goals, whether you look at energy transition, whether you look at migration, or then the security issue, now those and international terrorism, now these can't be tackled only by G7 countries and the EU. So they need certain kind of support and also legitimacy to their actions. But of course, other countries like India, they are not members of G20. So obviously,
Okay.
the goal is not there in the main kind of issues, but still they can bring certain issues. They can remind them of their responsibilities. Like in the last 2 3 years now, the global development assistance which all the G7 countries used to give, there is a clear decline, and this has also created problems. And on climate responsibilities, country like US, they are now running away from this. So this is also now responsibility of countries like India and many others to remind them that yes, you are important economies, and then they also have important role in the institutions of global governance. But then there are other things which are happening, other technologies which are emerging in the global south, which we tell them, like our program of initiative of lifestyle for environment, and many other initiative, women-led development, etc. So we can also bring some of those issues at the table. And obviously, when I think in one of the meetings earlier, our Prime Minister, when he mentioned that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is not just only about climate, this is also applied to many other issues as well. So,
Indeed.
yes, their relevance might have gone down a little bit economically. Still, they are, I mean, have certain consequence, but at the same time, they do have certain global responsibilities which they need to be reminded again and again by the countries of the global south, and India can take that lead there.
Okay, okay. And Mr. Bhatia, India has been a special invitee at G7 from 2019 onwards. Almost every G7 summit, India has been represented there. It has put forth its point of view. What does India bring to the table as far as G7 is concerned? Why are we important to them?
Yes, let us look at that reverse coin, and we go back to what Prime Minister Mark Carney said, and he has been saying since then, because he has come under some criticism within his own country. I think the first basic point he made was the global stature of India as a rising economy. He said India is the fifth largest economy, and he said this at a time when the official word in Delhi is that India has already become the fourth largest economy. So there was a bit of discrepancy there. Prime Minister Carney also referred to India's role in the global supply chains. And, the unsaid part naturally is that India is the world's largest democracy. It has a certain stature. It has, above all, increased that stature by successfully hosting G20 and showing its tremendous capacity and capability to serve as the bridge between the North and the South. And that appeals to the Canadians a great deal. And of course, on top of that, now we have an enlightened new Prime Minister of Canada who has great experience in financial management of affairs as former governor of Bank of Canada and Bank of England. So he understands the economic and political importance of India. So in short, we can accept as a given that G7 is relevant to India, and India certainly is very relevant and important to Canada, and not just because of the reasons of bilateral relations, and I'm not touching them, but essentially due to the global and multilateral calculations. So India, as somebody said, should not just be at the table, it is very much the table itself.
Okay. We'll come to the bilateral part a bit later, but since we're talking about G7 and India, Professor Sachdeva, do you also agree with this part, as Mr. Bhatia was referring to, that India being considered as the voice for global South is really significant and important for this grouping, that is the G7, because most of their economic interests lie in global South only.
Well, that's true, because I think it's both ways. It's important for them to bring country like India to listen to the voice of the global South. Similarly, India being present there as a voice of the global South, this also is useful for India as well. You remember during our G20, we had these three voice of the global South summits. So during all those meetings, more than 125 countries participated. Since then, we have been trying in different ways to remind the world that India is a leading part or leading power of the global South. Because China, many countries would consider whether you consider this a global South or not, because since China considers itself to be global South, so they are also trying to project itself as a leader of the global South, and they also have a lot of projects and other things in all developing countries, and of course also very important trading partners. But India also being a democracy, and also the legacy of non-aligned movement and new international economic order and all the South-South cooperation, what we have been doing. So we also legitimately feel that India should also represent global South. So many of those issues are important for India as well as also for G7 countries, because whatever decision they are going to take, they also know very well that these decisions are not going to be implemented or going to be accepted at many other international forums unless there is a legitimacy, unless the other countries also are kind of somehow part of those decision-making processes. Of course, we are not directly, as I said, involved there, but they try to bring, that is precisely the reason they have called South Africa, Mexico, India, and many other countries from the global South to be part of these proceedings. So then at least they can claim that they have also listened to their views. And of course, I think there are, I would say, two or three issues here. One is how coherent this particular G7 is at the moment. That is also at the test. Similarly, how they are going to deal these major issues, particularly on issues concerning trade and all those bilateral issues. Because in India, we'll come back to later, perhaps, how this is being watched very carefully in India is not that India is going to be there at the G7. That's important because it's an important global forum. So if India is being invited, India is being represented, that's good thing for India, because at least
Okay.
then our leader would be able to meet other leaders, and then certain things may happen. But how this will suddenly might have certain positive change in India's bilateral relations with Canada, because if you can see all other G7 countries and the EU, we have strategic partnership, so they're very
Indeed.
close. We were also very close with Canada as well, and our even free trade agreement was almost done. So there, and of course the other our cultural and other
Indeed, indeed.
Indeed, you're right, Professor Sachdeva, and we'll come to that part also. But since you mentioned few things, and I'd like to take Ambassador Bhatia's viewpoint on that. Ambassador Bhatia, when we're talking about what India brings to the table, there's also a question of what do we take away from this table, even if India is the table. Now, the reason why I'm asking this is because in the given geopolitical situation, there are, very severe internal fissures amongst several members of this grouping. And those are pretty evident, specifically after President Trump having taken over in his second term. And those statements coming in from all these leaders is quite evident of the fact that not all is well. Also, there are two elephants in the room as far as G7 is concerned. That is Russia and China. So what do we take away from here?
Yes, I think Professor Sachdeva has dwelt on this earlier, and I would like to share my perspective very briefly with you. G7 is no longer a united front today. There is a serious cleavage between the American and the European pillar. And this cleavage or this unity is on at least three major issues. First of all, on the question of European security, and specifically the approach on Ukraine. So as we know, President Zelensky is one of the 8 leaders invited, and it will be very interesting for a country like India to watch as to how the Americans and the Europeans try to bridge their differences while pushing for their shared agenda of securing victory in Ukraine and also peace. The second issue very clearly is the issue of economic tariffs. EU is completely opposed to them. Americans are hell-bent on pursuing them. So it'll be worthwhile watching from close quarters as to how they resolve this very important matter to them. And the third issue is the strategy towards what you call the elephants in the room, Russia and China. To Europe, Russia is the number one threat. To US, Russia is not such a threat, and America is essentially focused on dealing with China. So there is a divergence there as well. Once again, I think for the Indian delegation, it will be a golden opportunity to learn as to how, in which way the camel is going to sit. So this is the subtle, imperceptible advantages for India when you are sitting at the conference site, talking to people for 48 hours and getting a feel as to which way the world is heading. So it's a golden opportunity in that sense. And I feel, I very much sincerely hope that Prime Minister will be able to go and participate and bring back some very rich insights from this conference.
Okay. Professor Sachdeva, let's now come back to the point which you were making earlier and which Ambassador Bhatia was also referring to. That's the India-Canada bilateral relations, because Canada is the host country. And of course, the leadership of both the nations will have an opportunity to engage once again, because we've seen a deterioration, rather nosediving of, the bilateral relations between Canada and India over the past few years under former Prime Minister Trudeau. Do you think that this is also a golden opportunity for both sides to, put aside their differences, let bygones be bygones, make a fresh start from here onwards, at least?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think, we had excellent relationship with Canada till, these things started happening. And then suddenly our relations, as we all know, deteriorated. So now I think the way things have evolved, if one is looking from outside, we were not invited till very recently. It means they were doing their own calculations, they were doing their own understanding, and similarly, there were also must be conversations with other G7 countries, which others also would have given their own views. At the end, Canada decided to invite Indian Prime Minister, and Indian Prime Minister also, very graciously actually accepted this invitation even at the last minute. It means there is a serious thought, by policymakers from both sides, which will have, I would say, very, I would say, significant implications for India-Canada ties. So for us, yes, apart from G7, what would happen at the G7, what we will be able to bring to the table, that's a different issue. But if this particular meeting can lead us to better relations with Canada or relatively normal relations with Canada, I think that will be a big achievement of this particular G7 as far as India is concerned.
Okay.
Uh, because there are, I mean, serious concerns we had about some of the activities of Khalistani separatists in Canada, which we have made it very clear to them. Now, for their purpose, they were using some of them for their own domestic political purposes. And not only that, I mean, that has been happening for quite some time. But they also made certain, false allegations against India. Like Indian agencies were involved in some killing of some of those people there in Canada. I mean, that was, and it was also, said in the Parliament of Canada and many other places. So it means because of that, now many things have happened. Now there is a change in leadership that has provided that opportunity. And also, I would say they have also realized perhaps by now the importance of India and pressure from others. And similarly, we have also perhaps realized that, I mean, for the benefit of our own trade, benefit of our own people, those who are, hundreds of thousands of students are going there, people are settling there. So there are a lot of, people to people, those connections, linkages. So a lot of interests are there by both the countries. And India being a, very large economy, provide a lot of opportunities. We were very close to FTA, which can happen anytime when the relations are, reasonably normal. So it means I think there is a very obviously calculation from both sides.
Okay.
And they would perhaps definitely move forward. That's why perhaps I did the first step. And one can hope that we are able to have normal relations. Obviously, there are certain concerns which they have shown. And if they come out with any evidence, etc., then I think government would be willing to look into this. But at the same time, we have our very serious concern about this, which has been made very clear to them.
Okay.
Those countries, both the countries know this, and they have moved forward. It means that homework has already been done. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invited India, and India wouldn't have gone there. So
Okay.
I would hope that some positive, movement, at least India-Canada relations after this summit.
Okay, a quick concluding comment from you, Mr. Bhatia, on India-Canada bilateral relations. Do you also believe that this G7 summit could turn the tide as far as the bilateral relation between both nations are concerned?
I agree broadly to the analysis by Professor Sachdeva, but I won't share his optimism at this stage. I think I would prefer to be very cautious and realistic. I think we have to recognize that there are internal dynamics in Canada which indicate that the process of normalization and reconciliation may actually move rather gingerly, may move forward slowly. But still, I think it is very much to be recognized as an opportunity for a reset and the political directions from the highest possible level should help the matters, but the next step would be important. Will the two foreign ministers going to meet and start working on the details of the reset? That is what our viewers should be watching after the summit is over.
Okay, indeed, you put it very succinctly out there that what is really important is whether the reset button, if at all, pressed by both the leaders, will be followed by real groundwork from both sides as far as India and Canada are concerned. And of course, the G7 countries, the G7 summit, and India, why they are significant to each other, the relevance of G7 as well. Thank you very much once again, Professor Gulshan Sachdeva and Mr. Bhatia as well, for sharing your valuable inputs and insight with us and our viewers of Worldview. We'll come back again next week with a different topic of global importance. Thank you. Keep watching Dialogus.